Welcome to this course of 8 lessons, which I hope will give you tools on how to interact with persons with different forms of disabilities. In fact, when talking about disability, which is a term we will discuss in one of the sessions, which is not necessarily appropriate, because we should focus much more on what are the abilities of everybody. Neither you nor me want to be defined by our weaknesses. We want to be defined by our strengths, what we're good at, and focus on that. And the same applies obviously to persons living with conditions and syndromes or having other forms of what sometimes are called disabilities. But that's the term that is used, and therefore we need to make a distinction between physical disabilities, which is quite obvious, relates to any type of physical impairment, sensorial disabilities, which mainly relates to persons who are blind or who might be mute, or I have included there also those who stutter, and those living with mental conditions and syndromes. Those living with mental conditions and syndromes require a different type of approach than those with physical conditions. Those with physical conditions have suffered a lot of discrimination in the past, and even 50, 60 years ago, it wasn't obvious that there should be a ramp when building a building, or why have stairs when you could actually do access in a different way. Stairs were done to give an impressive appearance to a building, but actually made it inaccessible for persons. For persons with sensorial disabilities, for instance, blind persons, it was different, the type of measures that were needed. And we will look a little bit into that issue today. Still, we want to focus the course particularly on those living with mental conditions and syndromes. If you look at any single group around the world, there's probably few, if any, group that is so systematically discriminated against. It's almost culturally acceptable in the Western world to give them an injection when they have a sudden reaction, rather than giving them half an hour of love and caring. In many places of the South, you might see that they are hidden away. That happened even in Sweden, my home country. Only less than 100 years ago, it was common for families that had a child living with a condition or syndrome to send them away to a faraway place in Sweden where they would be cared for, but invisible. And it is therefore something that still prevails around the world. About 200 million of them, probably more, live really in a very discriminated way. And sometimes we don't understand really the extent to which this discrimination really affects them. We think that persons living with conditions and syndromes don't understand, but the reality is very different. And I would like to take an example from a friend of my own, Nando, and his life in a group home, living with 5 others who are nonverbal. Nando himself is verbal, but he has nobody to talk to. And I will tell you a little bit about him just to give you a first flavor of how they live a life of discrimination. And I hope you will enjoy this course. It is 8 lessons in which we try to go through different types of conditions and syndromes. What are their developmental opportunities? What type of work can they have? What are their rights? And towards the end, we'll look a little bit also towards the language issues. What language do we use? But also the importance in any type of profession to engage with them. But let me start with physical disabilities. We are more familiar very often with those who sit in a wheelchair, with those who have lost perhaps an arm, a leg, or have other physical conditions that makes it difficult for them to move around. There, the challenge is primarily one of access. So only 60, 50, 60, 70 years ago, you could still have many public buildings with stairs. You didn't have accessibility for those sitting in a wheelchair. And when you discuss the issue of accessibility, people would say, oh, but it's so few that sit in a wheelchair, we don't need to do these ramps. Instead of seeing it from the point of view that we can develop a building code so that everyone can have access. So things have been changing for the better for those with physical disabilities. Still, a friend of mine, Kara, who because of a regressive muscular disorder, just some 2-3 years ago, she was passing through Miami in her wheelchair. And somebody at the airport was saying, well, why do you travel at all? When you are like this, you should stay at home. And I mean, it's incredible how staff at the airport, Miami International Airport, can be saying something like that to somebody in a wheelchair. So even those with physical disabilities still meet discrimination. So we have certainly challenges, and we need to see how we can obviously improve accessibility for all of them. Now, let me switch over to sensorial disabilities. I'm using that term not as a technical term. And in fact, I may do a parenthesis here. I'm consciously trying to make all these presentations in a non-technical language. I know the majority of you are professionals or studying to become professionals. And I think it's very important that as part of being professional, we learn how to explain things in a manner, as I sometimes say, so that my mother or grandmother could understand. It's very important that professional language doesn't create a distance from persons that need this knowledge we need to share with them. So consciously, I will be using a non-technical language. You will become familiar when you study physical therapy or other types of behavior therapy and other types of professional lines. You certainly will learn the professional language. But when communicating with parents who sometimes are desperate because their son or their daughter have been diagnosed having autism or having some other type of condition, it's very important that we communicate in a way that doesn't make them feel that they don't understand. So sensorial disabilities I use generally for the term of those who are deaf or who are blind, but also those who stutter. I usually use the example of stuttering because it's a specific group of persons. Out of 5, 4 would be men and 1 would be women. It's less prevalent among women, more prevalent among men. But the suicide rate among them is among the highest in the world if you take a specific group, because they are so systematically bullied. In some circles, it's kind of acceptable to joke about persons that stutter. And even for many of us, even myself, I had to learn that when being with a person that stutters, just to be relaxed and not get stressed about the difficulty they might have in completing a word or in completing a sentence, but just giving them time. And when they realize that I'm not being stressed about the fact that they have difficulties completing a word or starting a word, and the fact that I should not try to fill in those words, I should just let them move at their pace, then they actually relax and stutter less. So you can really become like a beacon of hope for somebody who stutters when you know how to interact with them and not stress them up by constantly trying to fill in words or try to fill in or say what they are trying to say. Let them just complete what they are trying to say. Let them speak at their pace. Now, those that are blind, we really have been trying since the turn of this millennium. The world, the countries of the world established first what was called the Millennium Development Goals, and in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, which seek human improvement in a number of areas: reduce the under 5 mortality of children, reduce maternal mortality at the time of birth, and reduce poverty, reduce hunger, improve access to water, different measures. Still, for blind people, the number of blind people using 1990 as a baseline has almost tripled. Now, for every blind person, there are about 10 persons that have extremely low vision. You could call them legally blind. They are unable to drive. Some might have, and I will not go into the different forms of partial blindness, but some, for instance, have a tunnel vision, so to speak. They can see at great distance. So when they are walking, they might not see a hole and fall into a hole. Now, I've been in touch with a number of blind people, particularly when in my visits to Argentina and in Kenya. And one of them, he has been in hospital 27 times with broken bones. And it's never been because of his fault. It's always because typical persons do stupid things that makes it difficult for blind people to move around. In one case, for instance, a truck reversed into a pathway to unload fridges. Now, a blind person was coming with his stick, and he couldn't see that this truck had opened the doors of the back of the truck. So he hit with his forehead straight into the metal of this door. And of course, he had to be taken to hospital with his skull basically crashed. Luckily, he recovered. But that was just one of the many accidents. On other occasions, somebody had not put a cover on those flood covers on the street, and he fell straight into one of those holes and broke his leg. So again, sewer cover, that's the right word. Somebody's helping me there. So those are examples of how the ones that actually create the problem for persons with disabilities are typical persons because of our lack of understanding. And that's why your engagement in this course is so important, because not only will you have tools, but you will have the possibility of also transmitting to others important information that can protect and improve the dignity of life of persons with different forms of disabilities. Now, let me switch to how, well, let me complete on the issue of blindness. The World Health Organization came out with a report not too long ago, establishing that actually today, between 60 and 80% of those that are blind or partially blind, that could either be prevented or could be operated. So you can see worldwide that the lack of understanding and identification, early identification of blindness, is leading to very serious difficulties. Now, we have in some countries a lot of older women who have basically become blind, but nobody knows, and they feel ashamed about letting anybody know that they are blind. And they know where everything is in the house, so nobody notices that they basically have become blind. And in the majority of the cases, it's because of cataracts, which, you know, in 5 minutes could be operated. And there are hospitals, for instance, the eye hospital in Nairobi, which is constantly, daily operating on so many people. But if there is no awareness around this, you may have many who continue being blind because they didn't know that they could be very easily operated, for instance, from cataracts. So without going into greater detail, we have huge challenges in terms of how we generate greater awareness around the possibilities for persons with different types of conditions and disabilities to move freely around. Here we have different philosophies. I'm giving you this course from Sweden, where I am at the moment. As you see, it's 11 o'clock, 11:30 in the evening, and still we have daylight here in Sweden. We're way up north. But here there is a tendency in Sweden to provide assistance to those, for instance, living with blindness. In Argentina, they have a different philosophy. In Argentina, they think it is better for blind people to learn to move around as freely as possible and have markers on the pathways down to the subways and so on, so that they can move independently and without an assistant. And I have seen blind people in Argentina going to banks, going to different businesses, doing shopping and so on, and they learn to move freely. So you can see different countries adopt different philosophies. The same with deafness. Some believe that they should try to learn how to read the lips and so on. Others put more emphasis on sign language. In Örebro, a city 200 kilometers from Stockholm, the university there, it's an obligation that any class have interpretation to sign language. So any deaf person can walk into any university session and there's obligation for there to be present an interpreter. So different countries use different approaches, but obviously in all cases we want persons with different forms of disability to live an as independently life as possible. Now let me turn to the third area, which will be the focus of this course: those living with conditions and syndromes. We have seen an increased level of diagnosis, for instance, around issues of autism. And perhaps the majority of you have heard the word autism, and perhaps some of you know someone that lives with autism. Autism is such a wide description that actually we talk about the autism spectrum, which means a very wide spectrum of conditions that are related to autism. In next session, we're going to go deeper into what are characteristics of autism. But I will touch a little bit on it today. Again, many misconceptions have been created, and the first ones that need to learn about different types of conditions and syndromes are parents. Very often parents try to negate or say, oh no, my child is just a little bit different, but he's completely okay. The problem with that is that we delay the possibility of initiating such type of training and development opportunities that help an autistic child to develop. The same with somebody with cerebral palsy or other types of conditions. Now, in the case of autism, the most noticeable thing is their difficulties with social contact or social awkwardness. And basically, an easier way of describing it would be that the knowledge part of the brain is not so well connected with the emotional part. So their lack of empathy is not because they haven't learned empathy or because they don't have empathy or whatever. They simply cannot feel. They can be hitting another child and they don't feel that this is hurting the other child. They might be speaking too loud in spite of being close to you. They cannot perceive that I'm using a tone of voice that is too high for you. That doesn't mean that he is stupid. It is actually simply that he doesn't have that ability to feel what would be the appropriate level of tone when speaking to you. Now, they can learn over the years. However, at the moment, the average age at which autism is being diagnosed is around 4.5 years. Now, if we could reduce that to 2 years of age, the diagnosis could be established already at 2 years of age. We would have an extra 2.5 years of a very important age for learning. You know how much a child learns between 2 and 4.5. And if we can achieve that it is reduced as low as possible, then we can start the support for somebody living with autism to understand how to speak or what tone of voice to use or how to understand what other people might mean. In one of the lessons, we interview Frederick, who lives with autism, and he explains that when his schoolmates talk to him, he takes them by exact word that they are saying, or if they are smiling, he thinks that they are liking what he's saying. And he said, I have come to realize that sometimes when they are smiling, they actually are not really smiling. And sometimes when they say something, they actually mean the opposite. He has to learn that because he has difficulties making that connection. On the other hand, persons with autism have a fantastic capacity for concentration around certain issues. And the world is starting to learn about it, and we as typical persons need to learn more to focus on the fantastic abilities that persons, for instance, with autism have. And during this course, you will hear how autistic persons are being employed in different contexts to do particular jobs and do it much more efficiently than a typical person. Cerebral palsy is a very different type of condition. In the majority of the cases, it's because of lack of air at the moment of birth, which affects particularly the motor part of the brain. The rest, in most cases, functions perfectly, but it affects in different ways depending on how long the lack of oxygen was at the moment of birth. But they basically live with three types of things that any one of us would hate. One is very high muscular tone. That is the electric signals that guide our muscle movements. Those signals are too strong, and they end up having their hands all tied up like this. Now, if no one helps them daily, several times a day, to just open their fingers and stretch out their arm, you will not break their arm. Rather the opposite. You will help that all those bones don't become completely twisted. And you would help so that those muscles actually can exercise instead of becoming completely atrophied. But if no one does that, it will become more and more difficult for them to actually work, to type, to write. So that's high muscular tone. Others have low muscular tone. That is, the signals that reach some of the muscles are too weak. The signal is, or at least the signal is not coming back to the brain with sufficient speed. So you might see them dropping down their head, for instance, because they are not aware that their head is falling down actually, and they need just help to put up their head, and that way gradually their brain might start recognizing that they shouldn't drop down the head in that way. And the third is spasm, where suddenly they get a very strong electric signal and they move their arm or leg. We have in the portal of this course some support and additional material that is completely voluntary for you. But there, for instance, there is a TED talk by someone, a woman living with cerebral palsy. She is fantastically funny. She's a humorist. Maysoon is her name. And her TED talk is absolutely stunning and fantastic. But she starts off her presentation at this TED Talk by saying, you see here my body moving. It's moving not because I want to. And that's how she starts her TED Talk. But how important isn't it for us as typical persons to understand such a condition? 3 weeks ago, every Saturday, I have a Zoom meeting with different young people living with various mental conditions and syndromes. And one of the participants was Kathy. Kathy lives with a syndrome called Prader-Willi. Prader-Willi is a syndrome that normally occurs in girls, and it doesn't show up until about 4 or 5 years of age. And it has several characteristics, including behavior issues, but also the function in the brain that tells them, now you have eaten enough, ceases to work. So they live in constant hunger. Now imagine yourself, you have been working the whole day. It's been hot. You didn't have a sandwich, whatever. You arrive back home starving. You haven't eaten the whole day. And you open the fridge and you look into that fridge to see what is there that I can have immediately to calm my hunger. Well, that's how somebody with Prader-Willi lives constantly. The parents have to put locks on the fridge. They have to put locks on any place where they keep food because they are constantly looking for food to eat. And they become completely and totally obese. So Kathy participated at this Zoom meeting about 3 weeks ago. And then a few days later, she got COVID and now she passed away. Now, when we had this Zoom meeting, after we got the news that she had died, it was amazing to see somebody with cerebral palsy. He said, I would like to pray. And it was very touching to hear him say a few words like that. Osvaldo, who usually he has a developmental delay, he might have an intellectual age, maybe of 5, 6, 7 years of age, although he's about 40, 45 years of age. He said, I want to tell you some of the memories I have of Kathy. And he would tell the story of how Kathy would inject herself with insulin before eating because she had diabetes as well. And Fabio, who usually is very impatient, he said, I think we should have a minute of silence. So all of us observed a minute of silence. And I was so touched by how all the other young persons who knew Kathy from before and during COVID times have been meeting over Zoom, how they could express feelings in so many different ways and really felt the departure of Kathy. And they needed also at the same time, you know, a way of expressing each one in their own way and the departure of Kathy. But Kathy represents those who live with Prader-Willi, and they tend to also have behavior issues. They have difficulties controlling their emotions when you tell them no. I sometimes, when it comes to behavior issues, use the example, if you are invited to a wedding and you go and get a beautiful dress, a beautiful suit, and you're going to fly from point A, from Miami to Houston for this wedding. And when you're boarding the plane with the gift and you have the new clothes, everything ready, and you're taking this flight, and this evening is the wedding. And somebody says, no, you're not allowed to board. You probably would get quite angry. And if they insist, no, we had to give the seat to somebody else. No, but I'm going to a wedding. I've spent, hundreds of dollars buying clothes and gifts and everything, and they are waiting for me at this wedding. You probably would get very, very angry. Now, for a person that has these type of behavior issues, even just a simple, when they want to say, I would like to go and say hello to the horses, but it's not the appropriate time to do so. It is much better to say, yes, let's go to the horses, but first let's go and say hello to the rabbits. You say it in that way, because if you say to them, no, we are not going now to see the horses, they would feel the same anger that you would feel if you're not allowed to board that plane. So those brakes are not functioning very well. So it's for us as typical persons to learn how we should be interacting in such cases. Now we will go through many other conditions during this course, and you will actually have an opportunity to hear, for instance, somebody with Down syndrome that is studying at the university, and you will hear somebody with cerebral palsy speak. You will hear somebody with autism explain how he feels living with autism and how he's managing. But let me focus before that on how important it is also to provide work opportunities for persons that live with conditions and syndrome. That's why we will devote time to different companies around the world that have made it a point to provide employment for persons that live with conditions and syndromes. Another issue that is very important is, how does it work with law enforcement? You probably might have heard that only 3 years ago in Miami, North Miami, an autistic boy was running across the street and his assistant ran behind him and finally managed to catch up with him and sat down with him and started managing to calm him down. He was in the more severe part of the autistic spectrum, and sometimes they feel a desperation at a certain type of situation, and we might not notice what that might be. It's a little bit as if you don't know how to swim and you're starting to drown. And when you're starting to drown, you start moving your arms, you start moving your legs. It would be very stupid of me to say, oh, he's crazy because he's moving his arms like this, or he's moving his legs like that. And if I start shouting at you, stop doing that, because if you do that, you're going to drown quicker. That is not the help that you would need at that moment of drowning. The help that you would have needed would be a warm, kind arm that lifts you up back onto the boat and sits next to you while you are trying to recuperate air and recuperate calm after such a difficult episode. Well, for some autistic persons, to enter into a room with a lot of unknown people, it's the same as if you were drowning without knowing how to swim. It's the same type of experience. So this boy, autistic boy in North Miami, was running across the street, and the assistant catched up with him and managed to calm him down. Somebody called the police and said a black man, the assistant, is chasing a white boy. The police arrived at the scene, saw this black man sitting next to this autistic child, and immediately shot the assistant. So you can see the consequences of having a lack of knowledge about this type of situation. Out of about 2 million people in prison in the United States, it is estimated that somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 of them live with some type of condition, and it was not understood by law enforcement or by the judicial system, their condition, and they did not receive the appropriate help. In the United Kingdom, it is almost regular that mothers that have a child, mothers living with a condition, that their child is taken away from them. And even when the child says, I would like to be with my mother, social services thinks that they know better, and they become the caretakers of the babies. We have so many other examples, and we will go through some of these examples in the course, because it's important to understand how they are really discriminated in very serious ways. I sit in the board of Special Olympics International. Special Olympics International is the part of the Olympic movement that provides opportunities or provides Olympic Games for athletes that live with mental conditions and syndromes. The next Olympics will take place in Kazan in Russia. The previous one were in Abu Dhabi in 2019. Summer Olympics in Abu Dhabi were a fantastic event with thousands of participants from about 180 countries around the world. Now, the president of Special Olympics, Tim Shriver, he wrote to 2 governors in the United States a year ago, asking for clemency for 2 who were on death row. Both had been Special Olympics athletes. Their condition was so severe that they could not distinguish a Monday from a Wednesday from a Friday. But both of them had been used by somebody else, in one case by his brother, in another case by a criminal, to kill somebody else. Basically, they put a gun and said, do this. And they felt used, or they felt they had to do what they were being told. And obviously, in all those cases, they continue, those that were the intellectual authors of the crime, they are free. But Tim Shriver wrote a letter asking for clemency and understanding that they lived with very severe conditions, and still there was no clemency and both were executed. So again, in all courses of life, whether in law enforcement, whether in the judiciary, it is very, very important to have a better understanding of those living with conditions and syndromes. In the medical field, the same way. Jose Guillermo has schizophrenia, deep autism, and has severe hip problems because of a malpractice during one operation 3 years ago. Now, his mother traveled about 1.5 years ago all the way to Tampa because 11 specialists were going to look into Jose Guillermo and his different conditions and see how they were going to help. When they entered the room, all these 11 specialists, all dressed in white, created a big commotion for Jose Guillermo. And he started hitting his head a little bit as if you were drowning. And he started biting his arm. And one of the medical doctors tried to control him, and Jose Guillermo immediately bit him. Upon which the medical doctors immediately called in the security guards, and the mother and the child were expelled out of the hospital, and they had to travel back from Tampa back to Miami without doing what was supposed to be done with the child. A total lack of understanding of those medical doctors on how to approach a child with severe autism. So again, also in the medical profession, it is fantastic if you can gain knowledge on how to approach and make the parents of a child like Jose Guillermo to feel at home, to feel at ease, when they see that you know how to relate with someone like Jose Guillermo. We hope that this course will provide you with all these tools that I am mentioning. Even in universities, we have problems. Juan Endara wrote to me just a few days ago. He lives with cerebral palsy. He is studying journalism at Florida International University, and he feels constantly discriminated. He has been able to find very interesting persons to be interviewed, famous artists and others, because he has a way of connecting with people. And after he brings those persons into contact with his fellow students in order to do interviews and so on, his fellow students kind of take over and basically steal the contact from him and do the interviews themselves, and he's left by the sidelines. And he feels this has been his fate all his life. He was telling me quite some time back when I got to know him that every morning he had to think through, how am I going to survive all the bullying at school today? Because he didn't want to come back and complain to his mother about all the bullying that he suffered. And he said in all the years he went to school, never did a teacher come out to help him or defend him. So I think all of us, in whatever profession we are, we need to learn how to interact and how to be better human beings, better fellow human beings to persons living with conditions and syndromes, but also giving them better opportunities. In the 7th session, we will go through human rights issues, and I hope that also will be useful, because what will change the situation for persons living with conditions and syndromes? I can assure you, it's not likely to come from Congress. It's not likely to come from Tallahassee and the Florida authorities. It's not likely to come from Miami-Dade County officials. It has to come from you in universities. I think you need to be in the forefront of new thinking on how we should relate and protect and provide dignity to life to persons living with conditions and syndrome in whatever professional area you are involved in. And I hope that all of you can come out of this course feeling empowered and stronger in how to protect the rights of persons living with conditions and syndromes. Again, you now have a few weeks until the 12th of July to go in and listen to the 2nd to the 7th lecture, which already have been uploaded. If some of your friends were unable to listen to this first lesson, Phyllis will tell us in a moment, but I think in about 24 hours it will also be uploaded. And again, I look forward to meet all of you on the 12th of July. And thank you so much for participating today. I hope this has been an appetizer for you to learn more and to participate in all lessons. Thank you so much.